The email arrived at 2:47 a.m. On a Tuesday, I was in the middle of reviewing quarterly reports for the regional office when the notification popped up on my phone's subject line read simply, "Paperwork attached." My name is Sarah Martinez. I'm 44 years old, and I've been the district manager for a medical supply company for the past 12 years. I opened the attachment thinking it was work-related. Instead, it was divorce papers saying dated and filed electronically by my husband of 16 years, Rick Martinez, had divorced me. Without a word of warning, without a conversation, without even a phone call. I stared at the screen for a long time, not processing what I was seeing. Then I checked our joint bank account, the one we'd used for mortgage payments, utilities, groceries for over a decade. Balance showed $127, where there should have been $89,000. I called the bank immediately, despite the early hour. Their automated system confirmed multiple large transfers over the past week, all authorized with our joint account access codes. I hung up and called Rick's cell phone. It went straight to voicemail. His outgoing message had changed too. "This is Rick. I'm traveling and won't be returning calls for the foreseeable future. Use email for urgent matters only." That's when I knew this wasn't impulsive. This wasn't some breakdown or midlife crisis. This was planned, methodical. And I was looking at the ruins of my life in real time. I didn't cry, didn't scream, didn't throw anything. Just sat at my kitchen table, the one Rick and I had picked out together at that furniture store in Phoenix 7 years ago, and started making a list. What I knew, what I didn't know, what I needed to find out. I've managed teams of people, solved logistical problems, handled crisis situations for over a decade. When something breaks you, don't panic. You assess the damage and make a plan. Rick and I met 18 years ago at a conference in Denver. I was working my way up in medical supply management. He was a freelance IT consultant, specializing in healthcare systems. We talked for hours about the inefficiencies in hospital procurement systems, about technology gaps that cost lives and money. He was smart, funny, and understood my work in ways most people didn't. We got married 2 years later, bought a house in Tempe, started building what I thought was a partnership. Rick's work was project-based. Sometimes he'd travel for weeks, setting up systems, training staff. Other times he'd work from home, managing networks remotely. The money was good when it was steady but irregular. I didn't mind. My salary was consistent and growing. We balanced each other out. Or so I thought. The first few years were solid. We traveled together when possible, shared responsibilities around the house, talked about having kids someday. But Rick always said he wanted to be more established. First wanted to build up his consulting business before taking on family responsibilities. I supported that decision, trusted his timeline. Around year 8, I started noticing changes, small things at first. Rick became more secretive about his work. Wouldn't discuss clients or projects like he used to, started keeping his laptop password protected. Something he'd never done before, said it was required by new security protocols from his clients. I accepted that explanation. I at work has different rules, different requirements for confidentiality. He also started traveling more frequently. Longer trips to places that seemed unusual. For his type of work, small towns in rural states, places that didn't typically have the kind of medical facilities that needed his expertise. But he explained he was expanding into different markets, working with smaller regional systems, trying to build a more diverse client base. Around year 12, the red flags became harder to ignore. Rick opened a separate business account, said he needed better separation between personal and professional finances for tax purposes. Made sense at the time. He was making more money, handling bigger contracts. The IRS requirements for contractors were getting stricter. He started receiving mail at a P.O. box. Said it was more professional than using our home address for business correspondence. His office space at home expanded. He converted our spare bedroom into a full IT setup. Multiple monitors, server equipment, filing cabinets. He kept locked when I asked about the expansion. He said his business was growing. He needed more sophisticated tools to manage multiple client networks simultaneously. I was proud of his success, glad to see him building something substantial. but I also started feeling like I was living with a stranger who happened to share my last name. Our conversations became limited to logistics. Who was handling what bills, when he'd be home from his next trip, what repairs the house needed. We stopped talking about future plans, stopped discussing dreams or goals. It felt like we were roommates managing a household rather than partners building a life together. I mentioned couples counseling once. Rick said we didn't need outside help. We were just going through a busy period. Once his business stabilized, things would get back to normal. I believed him because I wanted to believe him, because the alternative was too unsettling to consider 6 months ago. Rick announced he was taking on a major project, multi-state healthcare system upgrade, that would require him to travel extensively for the next year, possibly longer. He presented it as a career-making opportunity, the kind of contract that would set us up financially for the long term. He showed me the preliminary paperwork. Impressive numbers, extended timeline, significant upfront payments. I was supportive, even though it meant months of essentially living alone, even though it meant putting our own plans on hold again the morning he left for this project. Rick was different, more affectionate than he'd been in years. He made breakfast, brought me coffee in bed, said he'd miss me more than usual. Something about the way he said it felt like goodbye, but I dismissed the thought as anxiety about the extended separation. He kissed me at the door, said he'd call that evening to let me know he'd arrived safely at the first client site. That call never came when I tried reaching him the next day. His phone went straight to voicemail. I left messages, sent texts, assumed he was busy with the new project, dealing with setup issues or travel delays by the end of the week. I was worried but not panicked. Rick had always been focused when starting new contracts. Sometimes he'd get so absorbed in problem solving that he'd forget to check in. It was annoying, but not unusual. What was unusual was the complete radio silence. No response to emails, no acknowledgement of my calls, no updates on his progress. I started calling some of his previous clients, people I'd met at company events or social gatherings, asking if they'd heard from Rick, if they knew anything about his current project. The responses were confusing. Several people said they hadn't worked with Rick in over a year. Others seemed surprised to hear he was married, said they'd never heard him mention a wife. One former client mentioned seeing Rick at a conference 6 months ago, but he'd been with a woman they assumed was his business partner, someone named Linda, who seemed to know his work intimately. That conversation lasted exactly 3 minutes before I hung up and started digging deeper. I accessed our joint credit card statements online, something I rarely did since Rick handled most of our financial coordination. What I found made my stomach drop. Charges for 2 plane tickets to the same destinations. Hotel rooms booked under both our names, except I'd never been on any of those trips. Restaurant bills for 2 people, jewelry purchases at stores I'd never visited, car rental agreements for vehicles I'd never driven. Rick had been living a double life for months, possibly years, using our joint accounts to finance it all. And I'd been too trusting, too focused on my own work to notice the pattern. I printed everything organized. The statements by date and location started building a timeline of Rick's deception while I was managing regional operations, thinking we were building a future together. Rick was systematically building an exit strategy with someone else. The divorce papers weren't the beginning of the betrayal. They were the final step in a plan that had been in motion for years. I should have seen it coming, should have questioned the changes, should have pushed harder when things didn't add up. But I'd been raised to trust my partner, to believe that marriage meant working through problems together, not planning secret escapes. Rick had counted on that trust had weaponized my faith in our partnership against me. Now I was sitting in my kitchen at 3 a.m., staring at evidence of the most comprehensive betrayal I'd ever experienced. But instead of falling apart, I was getting angry. Not the hot, explosive kind of anger that makes you do stupid things, the cold, calculating kind that makes you dangerous. I'd spent my entire career solving problems that other people created, fixing systems that other people had broken. Rick had made one critical error in his planning. He'd assumed I was the same person he'd married 16 years ago, the woman who'd defer to his expertise, who'd accept his explanations without question, who'd prioritize keeping peace over seeking truth. But I wasn't that person anymore. I was a senior manager who'd learned to spot deception, who'd developed instincts for when people were trying to manipulate systems for their own benefit. Rick was about to discover that the woman he'd been lying to for years was much more dangerous than the woman he'd married, and I had resources he'd never bothered to learn about the next morning. I called in sick to work for the first time in 3 years, told my assistant I had a family emergency and wouldn't be available for the next few days. That was true enough. Then I started making calls. The first was to my friend Janet, who worked in private investigation, mostly corporate fraud cases, but she'd helped me before when we suspected employee theft at one of our warehouses. Janet didn't waste time on sympathy, just asked what I needed. I need to find my husband, I said, and I need to know everything about what he's been doing for the past 2 years. Janet was quiet for a moment, then said, "Bring me everything you have, account statements, travel records, phone bills, business documents, whatever you can find. I'll start pulling public records and see what Rick's been up to." Officially. The second call was to my brother Marcus, who worked in banking, specifically in fraud prevention. If Rick had been moving money around, Marcus would know how to track it and how to stop it. Marcus listened while I explained the situation, then said, "Sarah, you need to move fast if Rick's been planning this for as long as you think he has. He's probably got more moves planned. You need to protect what's left before he can take it." I spent the morning gathering documents. Rick's business papers weren't in his locked filing cabinet anymore, but I found backup copies in his email account still logged in on our shared computer. His password was the same one he'd used for years. Apparently, he'd never considered that I might need to access his information for legitimate reasons. What I found was worse than I'd expected. Rick hadn't just been having an affair. He'd been building an entirely separate life. Linda wasn't just a girlfriend. She was listed as his business partner on incorporation documents for a company I'd never heard of. They'd been operating together for over 3 years. Using contracts and client relationships Rick had developed while married to me, but channeling the profits into accounts with only their names on them, they'd bought property together in Colorado, a house listed under their joint LLC. They'd opened business lines of credit, using Rick's established reputation, but excluding me from any benefits or legal protections. They'd even filed taxes together as business partners, while Rick was still filing jointly with me as a married couple. The level of deception was staggering, but it was also sloppy. Rick had gotten careless, probably overconfident in his ability to manage the deception. He'd left digital breadcrumbs everywhere. Emails discussing their plans to dissolve his marriage documents, showing their intent to relocate the business to Colorado. Once he was legally free, calendar entries, scheduling meetings with divorce attorneys months before he'd filed the papers by noon. I had enough evidence to prove Rick had been systematically stealing from our marriage to fund his new life with Linda. But I also had something else. I had their plan. They weren't just stealing from me, they were stealing from Rick's clients too. The new business was billing for services that Rick's original company had already provided, double-charging healthcare systems that trusted his reputation. They were committing fraud on multiple levels, and they'd been doing it for years. Janet called while I was reviewing the tax documents. "You're not going to believe what I found," she said. "Rick Martinez isn't just married to you, he's been married to Linda for 8 months. Bigamy is a felony in most states, and Rick just handed you enough evidence to put him in prison." I hung up and sat in Rick's former office, surrounded by the evidence of his crimes, looking at the expensive equipment he'd bought with our money to support his fraudulent business, thinking about how methodical he'd been, how patient, how thoroughly he'd planned to destroy my life while building his new one with Linda. That's when I realized something important. Rick had made the same mistake that a lot of smart people make when they commit crimes. He'd assumed everyone else was less intelligent than him, less capable of understanding complex schemes, less willing to fight back. He'd underestimated me completely, and now I had something he didn't expect: a complete picture of his criminal enterprise and the motivation to use it. If Rick wanted a divorce, he was going to get one, but not the kind he'd planned. I picked up the phone and called the FBI Financial Crimes Division. Then I called the State Attorney General's office. Then I called the IRS fraud hotline. Rick had spent years building his house of cards. Now I was going to watch it collapse, and I was going to make sure everyone who'd been hurt by his schemes got justice, starting with me. The FBI agent who returned my call was named Detective Patricia Williams. She'd been investigating healthcare fraud for 12 years, and she was very interested in Rick's operation, especially when I mentioned the double billing scheme and the falsified business partnerships. "Can you come in this afternoon?" she asked. "I have a feeling your husband's activities are part of a larger pattern we've been tracking." "I can be there in an hour," I said. "Good. Bring everything you have, and Ms. Martinez, be prepared for this to take a while. Cases like this tend to uncover more crimes than anyone expects." I drove to the FBI field office with 3 boxes of documents and a laptop full of Rick's digital communications. For the first time since reading that divorce email, I felt like I was moving forward instead of just reacting to Rick's plans. Detective Williams was a compact woman in her 50s with gray hair and sharp eyes. She listened to my story without interruption, taking notes and occasionally asking for clarification. When I finished, she reviewed some of the documents I'd brought, then looked up at me. "Mrs. Martinez, your husband has been busy. The business fraud alone is worth investigating, but the bigamy charge makes this federal since he's been crossing state lines to commit crimes. We'll need to coordinate with Colorado authorities, but I think we can help you get your money back and make sure Rick faces consequences for what he's done. More importantly," she continued, leaning forward slightly, "we've been investigating a network of fraud cases in healthcare. Several companies have reported similar schemes, double billing false partnerships, equipment purchases that never got delivered. Your husband's operation fits the pattern perfectly. There may be other victims we don't know about yet." I signed a formal complaint and handed over copies of everything I'd found. Detective Williams promised to begin the investigation immediately and to keep me informed of any developments as I left the federal building. My phone rang. It was Rick's number. I almost didn't answer, but then I realized this might be my only chance to hear his voice before he found out what was coming. I answered without saying hello. "Sarah, thank God you picked up." Rick's voice was strained, nervous. "I know you're probably confused about the divorce papers, but I can explain everything. I just need some time to sort out a few business issues. Then we can talk about this properly, like adults." I listened to him lie, wondering how many times he'd practiced this speech, how many scenarios he'd prepared for, confused. I said finally, "That's an interesting word choice for discovering that my husband is a bigamist who's been stealing from me for years." The silence on the other end of the line lasted almost 30 seconds. "Sarah, I don't know what you think you found, but you're misunderstanding the situation. I'm trying to protect you from some complicated business problems that you don't need to be involved in." "Protect me," I repeated, "by emptying our bank accounts and marrying someone else, by stealing from your clients and committing federal crimes." "Rick, how exactly does that protect me look?" he said, his voice getting sharper. "I didn't want it to happen this way, but you've always been too focused on your own career to understand what I was building. I needed someone who could be a real partner in the business. Linda understands the industry. She can contribute in ways that you never could." There, it was the truth. Finally, Rick wasn't just leaving me for someone else. He was leaving me because he'd decided I wasn't good enough to be part of his criminal enterprise. He'd convinced himself that his fraud was actually business innovation, that his bigamy was actually relationship evolution, that his theft was actually financial strategy. I almost laughed. "Rick," I said, "I hope you and Linda are very happy together for the next few months before you're both arrested for federal crimes." Then I hung up and blocked his number. I had work to do. The investigation moved faster than I'd expected. Detective Williams called the next morning with an update. "We executed search warrants on your husband's Colorado property and his business accounts." She said, "What we found confirms everything you suspected, plus some things you probably didn't. Rick and Linda have been running this scheme for over 4 years. Not just 2. They've defrauded at least 12 healthcare systems and 3 other women besides you. Rick has been married to multiple women simultaneously, using their resources to build his business, then disappearing when the relationships became inconvenient. What happened to the other women? I asked. Most of them never reported the crimes. They were too embarrassed, or they blamed themselves for not seeing the warning signs. One woman lost her house, another had her credit destroyed. Linda was probably victim number 3 before she became accomplice, number 1. So Linda didn't know about me initially. Detective Williams was quiet for a moment. We're still sorting that out. But based on the evidence we found, Linda knew about at least 2 of Rick's other marriages. By the time she married him, she was definitely complicit in the fraud scheme, and she helped plan the systematic theft from your accounts. She's not another victim, Ms. Martinez. She's a co-conspirator. The Colorado authorities arrested Rick and Linda that afternoon. They were in the process of packing up their house, apparently preparing to move to a non-extradition country. When the FBI arrived, Rick's carefully planned escape route had become a dead end. His methodical approach to crime had created a paper trail that led investigators directly to him, and Linda had been documenting everything, thinking they were building a legitimate business, but actually creating evidence of their conspiracy. I got the call while I was at work, trying to catch up on the tasks I'd missed during my investigation. My assistant knocked on my office door, said there was a detective on the phone with an update about my case. Ms. Martinez, this is Detective Williams. We have Rick and Linda in custody, and we've frozen all their accounts. We've also recovered most of your money, and we're working on getting restitution for the other victims. This is going to be a long process, but I wanted you to know that the immediate threat is over. They can't hurt you or anyone else anymore. I thanked her and hung up, then sat in my office looking out at the medical supply warehouse I'd been managing for 12 years, thinking about how much my life had changed in just 1 week. Rick had spent years planning to destroy me, to steal everything I'd worked for, and disappear into a new life with his accomplice. But his plan had one fatal flaw. He'd underestimated me completely. 6 months later, I was standing in a federal courtroom watching Rick and Linda accept plea deals that would send them to prison for the next 8 years. The judge had been thorough in her condemnation of their crimes, calling them a systematic betrayal of trust that had damaged not just their victims, but the entire healthcare industry. Rick looked smaller than I remembered, diminished by the orange jumpsuit and the weight of his crimes. Linda looked like she wanted to disappear entirely. They'd both aged years. In the months since their arrest, the stress of facing consequences for their actions had taken its toll. Rick glanced at me once during the proceedings, but I didn't acknowledge him. We had nothing left to say to each other. The man I'd married had been replaced by someone I didn't recognize years ago, and I'd just been too trusting to notice the change. The restitution hearing was scheduled for the following month. Detective Williams expected that I'd recover most of my money, plus damages. For the emotional and financial harm Rick had caused the other victims would also receive compensation, though some losses couldn't be calculated in dollars. The betrayal went deeper than money. It was about trust, about the fundamental assumptions that make marriage and partnerships possible. Rick had poisoned that for all of us, but he'd also taught us something valuable about our own strength, about our ability to fight back when someone tries to destroy us. I drove home to the house Rick and I had shared, thinking about the future for the first time in years. I owned it outright. Now, Rick's share had been forfeited as part of the restitution agreement, and I was considering what to do next. My job was secure. My finances were recovering, and I had a clarity about my priorities that I'd never had before. Rick had tried to steal my life, but instead, he'd given me something I'd never expected freedom from, the fear of being betrayed again, because I'd learned I was stronger than I'd ever imagined. I was capable of fighting back in ways that mattered, and I was ready to build something new, something that belonged only to me.